2 words. That is the entirety of John 11, verse 35. 2 words in the English, 3 letters in the Greek. Etakrusin. He wept. It is the shortest verse in the Bible, and it might be the most important one. Think about what you are reading when you read it. You are reading that the God who spoke the universe into existence, who called light out of darkness, who breathed life into dust, who set the stars in their places like lamps hung in a window, stood outside a tomb in a village called Bethany, and cried. Not performed sorrow, not a theological gesture. Tears, real ones, running down a real face. If that doesn't stop you, read it again. Now here is what I want you to know before we go any further. Most people think Jesus wept once. Outside Lazarus's tomb, the shortest verse, end of story. But that is not the full picture. There are 3 moments in the Gospels where Jesus cries. 3. And they are not the same kind of crying. The Greek uses 3 different words for 3 different kinds of grief. And once you see the difference, you will never read any of them the same way again. There is one more thing. The 3rd moment, one most Christians have never been told about, does not appear in the Gospels at all. It appears in a letter, written to people who were suffering. And it might be the rawest, most vulnerable thing recorded about Jesus in the entire New Testament. We will get to that moment. But not yet. First, a village, family, and a man who arrived 4 days too late. Bethany was a small village on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives, about 2 miles from Jerusalem, close enough to walk to the city in an afternoon, far enough that it felt like a different world. Mary and Martha lived there with their brother Lazarus. And if you read the Gospels carefully, this family is one of the only households Jesus seems to visit just because he wants to. Not to preach to a crowd, not to heal a stranger, just to sit at a table and be with people who knew him. So when Lazarus got sick, the sisters did the most natural thing in the world. They sent a message. Lord, the one you love is sick. Not come heal him. Just that. An announcement of need. The kind of message you send to someone you trust completely. And Jesus did not come. He stayed where he was for 2 more days. And Lazarus died. Stay with me here because this is not negligence. John tells us plainly that Jesus loved this family. But he also tells us that Jesus waited deliberately because what was about to happen would show the world something that nothing else could show it. God was not absent. God was setting a stage. But try to imagine being Martha. You sent the message. You waited. You watched your brother's breathing get slower. You watched it stop. You prepared the body. You said the prayers. You placed him in the tomb. And then you sat in a house full of mourners. And the man you sent for never came. When Jesus finally arrives, it is Martha who runs out to meet him. And what she says is not a greeting. It is barely controlled grief. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. If you had been here. For words that have been said to God in 1,000 different forms by 1,000 different people in 1,000 different kinds of loss. If you had been here, if you had stepped in sooner, if you had answered the prayer. If Jesus doesn't flinch from it. He doesn't explain himself defensively. He says, your brother will rise again. Martha, in her grief, gives the theological answer she has been taught. I know he will rise again, in the resurrection, at the last day. She believes the doctrine. She just doesn't believe it changes anything about right now. And then Jesus says something to her that has stopped people cold for 2,000 years. I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. He is not talking about a future event. He is saying, I am the event. I am not pointing you toward the resurrection. I am the resurrection, and I am standing in your driveway. Martha goes back inside. She finds her sister Mary and whispers to her, the teacher is here. He's asking for you. And here is what Mary does. She doesn't walk to him. She runs. And when she reaches him, she falls at his feet. The same feet she had anointed with perfume a few chapters earlier, and she says the exact same words Martha said. Word for word. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Same grief, same question, same accusation wrapped in love. Here's what most people miss. Jesus doesn't repeat his theological answer to Mary. He doesn't say, "I am the resurrection" again. He looks at her. He sees the people around her weeping, and the Greek says something remarkable. It says he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. The word for deeply moved is embermeomai. It means something closer to a groan, a shudder, to anger, even. Some scholars translate it as a shuddering of the whole body, like a horse before a battle. Something in him is not at peace with what he is seeing. And then they show him the tomb, and he weeps, at a crucin, not the wailing, not the loud sobs, silent tears streaming down. The crowd sees it and says, "See how he loved him." And they are right. But that is not the only reason. Because here is the part nobody tells you. Jesus knows what he is about to do. He knows Lazarus is coming out of that tomb in approximately 90 seconds. He has known this since before he arrived. He has known it since before Lazarus got sick. So the tears are not tears of helplessness. They are not tears of, "I don't know what to do." They are something stranger and deeper than that. He is weeping at what grief does to the people he loves. He is weeping at the reality of death, not because death has won, but because death is real and it costs real things from real people. He is not weeping for Lazarus. Lazarus is about to be fine. He is weeping for Mary. He is weeping for Martha. He is weeping for the world in which people lose each other and cannot get each other back. And then he walks to the tomb and he tells them to roll the stone away, and he prays out loud so that the people standing there will know that what happens next comes from the Father. And he calls out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." And Lazarus comes out, still wrapped in grave clothes, still blinking, alive. Now I need you to jump forward in time, from Bethany to Jerusalem, from a private garden of grief to a public parade. 5 days before the crucifixion, Palm Sunday, the most famous entry into a city in the history of the world. The crowd is enormous. People are cutting palm branches and spreading them on the road. They are shouting. They are celebrating. They have been waiting for this, for a king, for liberation, for the hope of Israel walking through the gate. And Jesus is riding a donkey down from the Mount of Olives toward the city, and the noise of the crowd is filling the valley, and it should be the highest moment of his ministry. And then he crests the hill, and he sees the city spread out before him, and he breaks down. Not etacrusin this time, not silent tears. This is eklon, the word for loud, heaving, convulsive sobbing. The ugly cry, the kind of weeping that shakes your shoulders and closes your throat. The kind you cannot hide and cannot stop. The crowd is cheering, and Jesus is weeping. And this is where it gets remarkable. Josephus, the Jewish historian who lived through the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, 40 years after this moment, describes what the city looked like from the Mount of Olives. He writes that you could see the whole city spread out below you, the white marble of the temple gleaming in the sun, the crowded streets of the lower city, the towers, the walls. It was, by any standard of the ancient world, one of the most breathtaking sights a person could see. Jesus saw all of that. And then he saw what no one else on that hill could see. He saw 40 years into the future. He saw the Roman legions under Titus surrounding the city. He saw the siege. He saw what happens when a city runs out of food and the gates are locked and there is no way out. He saw the temple, that gleaming, impossible building, consumed in fire. He saw the walls come down stone by stone. He saw the end of a world, and he wept over it, not in anger, in grief. What he says is one of the most heartbreaking things in all of the Gospels. If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace. But now it is hidden from your eyes. He speaks to the city the way you speak to someone you love who is walking toward a cliff and cannot see it. You can see it. They cannot. And there is nothing more you can do. The days will come upon you, he tells Jerusalem, when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. He is describing, in something close to the present tense, something that will not happen for 4 decades. He is describing it because he can see it the way you and I can see something directly in front of us. And the reason he gives for what is coming breaks your heart. Because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. He is riding into the city on a donkey. The crowd is cheering. And he is weeping because the crowd is cheering for a military deliverer, and he is something they don't have categories for yet. He came to Jerusalem to die for Jerusalem, and Jerusalem does not know it. He weeps for people who are celebrating him. Pay attention to this, because that is not a small thing. That is not a Jesus who is angry at rejection. That is a Jesus who is brokenhearted for people who are genuinely happy to see him, who will genuinely turn on him in 5 days, who genuinely do not understand what they are looking at, and he does not hold it against them. He weeps over them, for them, because of what is coming for them. This is the second weeping, Eklon, the loud one, over a city. The third one is different from both. Most people know Gethsemane as the place where Jesus prayed before his arrest, where he asked if the cup could pass from him, where his disciples fell asleep, where Judas arrived with the soldiers. Most people do not know about the weeping. It does not appear in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. You will not find it in John. It appears in a letter written to a group of people who were suffering and tempted to quit. The letter is called Hebrews, and in the 5th chapter, almost as a passing remark, comes one of the most startling sentences in the New Testament. During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. Fervent cries and tears. The Greek word for fervent cries is krouge, and it does not mean quiet sobbing. Krouge is used in the New Testament for the shouting of a crowd, for the screaming of a man tormented by a spirit, for the battle cries of soldiers charging. It is loud. It is raw. It is the sound of someone at the absolute end of their reserves. In Gethsemane, Jesus screamed, and he wept, alone, in a garden, while the disciples slept nearby. Here is what I want you to sit with for a moment. At Lazarus's tomb, Jesus wept for what death does to the people he loves. On the Mount of Olives, Jesus wept for a city that couldn't see what was coming. In Gethsemane, Jesus wept for himself, for what was coming for him, for the weight of what he had agreed to carry. This is not weakness. This is not a failure of faith. The writer of Hebrews does not tell us this story to embarrass Jesus. He tells us this story because it is the whole point. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses. That is the verse that comes a few lines later. The weeping in Gethsemane is not a footnote. It is the foundation of the argument. Jesus can empathize with your darkest night because he had one. A real one. With real screaming, real tears, real terror. Luke tells us that in Gethsemane, Jesus' sweat fell like drops of blood, a medical condition known as hematidrosis, which can occur under severe psychological and physical stress. The body, pushed past its limits, begins to hemorrhage through its own skin. He was not performing anguish. He was experiencing it at the cellular level. And in that garden, an angel came to him, not to take the cup away, not to explain why it had to happen, just to strengthen him, to be present with him. Hold that thought. Eusebius, writing in the 4th century, records that the early Christians treated Gethsemane as a sacred site precisely because of what happened there, because they understood that something was offered in that garden that went beyond the arrest. Something costly. Something that cost Jesus not just his life but his peace, before his life was even taken. 3 moments of weeping. 3 different Greek words. 3 different kinds of grief. At a tomb. Over a city. In a garden. And what ties them together is this. Every time Jesus wept, he was weeping for someone or something beyond himself, except once. And that once was the worst night of his life. And even then, Scripture does not tell us he stopped and composed himself and moved on. It tells us an angel came, and then he got up, and he walked out of the garden toward the people who were coming to arrest him. He walked toward it, eyes open. There is a reason this matters for you today. Not just as theology, not just as history. You have probably wept in a way you couldn't explain to anyone. Maybe you wept for someone you were about to lose and hadn't lost yet. And the grief came early, before the thing had even happened, and you didn't know what to do with it. Maybe you wept over something you could see coming that nobody around you could see. Maybe you wept alone, in the dark, in a way you were ashamed of afterward because it felt too raw, too broken, too loud to be acceptable. Jesus did all three. He wept before the miracle. He wept over people who didn't know they needed to be wept over. And he wept alone, with a sound the New Testament compares to a battle cry, in a garden where no one was awake to hear him. There is a verse in the Psalms that says God collects your tears in a bottle, that he keeps a record of them. The image is of someone who considers your tears precious enough to preserve. But here is what strikes me about that image now, having sat with these three moments: the God who collects your tears is the same God who shed his own. He is not a God who watches grief from a safe distance. He is a God who entered it, who stood at a tomb and felt the weight of loss the way you feel the weight of loss, who looked at a city he loved and sobbed because he could see what was coming and they could not, who knelt in a garden and screamed. And this is where it gets to the bone. The shortest verse in the Bible is not a theological footnote. It is an answer to every person who has ever prayed in the dark and wondered if God understands what it feels like. He does. Not metaphorically, not in principle. He stood outside a tomb and cried. He sat on a donkey above a city and wept so hard the crowd must have noticed. He knelt in a garden and offered up, in the words of Hebrews, prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears. He knows what it costs to love something you might lose. He knows what it feels like to see disaster coming and be unable to stop it without sacrificing the very thing you are trying to save. He knows what it feels like to be alone in the dark with something too heavy to carry, and to feel the ground of your own resolve giving way beneath you. And he got up. Now let me give you three things to take with you. The first, your tears are not a failure of faith. Jesus wept before a miracle. He was not weeping because the miracle wasn't coming. The miracle was seconds away. He wept because grief is real, and real grief deserves to be honored. If the Son of God stood at a tomb and cried even though he knew everything was about to be okay, then you are allowed to weep in the middle of your waiting. The tears do not mean you don't believe. Sometimes the tears are what believing looks like. The second, God weeps over things you don't know he is watching. Jesus wept over Jerusalem from a hillside while Jerusalem celebrated below him. There are losses coming in your life, seasons, relationships, chapters you don't see ending, that God can already see, and that he has already grieved. You will not weep alone when those losses arrive. You will walk into grief that God entered before you got there. The third, the worst moment Jesus ever had did not end him. It moved through him. He screamed in a garden. An angel came. He got up and walked toward the worst night of his life with his eyes open. And what came after that night was not more darkness. What came after that night was the thing that darkness has never been able to answer. He who dries every tear first had to shed his own. If this reached you today, if it reached you in a season where prayer feels like shouting into silence, then I want you to know something. That silence you are shouting into, it has heard shouting before. From the inside. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper into the parts of Scripture that don't get the big stages but carry more weight than almost anything else. And if someone in your life is carrying grief right now, someone who needs to know that God is not distant from their pain, share this with them. Not as a sermon, just as a story. Because sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do for someone is let them know they are not the first person to weep without being immediately answered. 2 words. 3 Greek letters, the shortest verse, the deepest proof. He wept.